isn't it?
From Friends of the Earth.
Yeah, from Friends of the Washington. On to you. Thanks very much.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm Chloe Waterman. I'm the Senior Food Campaigner at Friends of the Earth. We're a national environmental organization. We have chapters in 74 different member countries, but I'm based out of our U.S. office, and my work is focused at the intersection of diet, climate, and public health. So happy to present to you today. So this presentation, kind of building off of Becky's, is also focused around meat reduction and specifically using institutional purchasing as a means of fighting climate change and improving public health outcomes. So I showed this slide, my not all protein is created equal slide, one to show the core reason why at Friends of the Earth we focus on meat reduction as a key component of sustainable dining. So you can see on the left-hand side here, lamb, beef, cheese, pork being significantly more emissions intensive than the plant-based foods, the pulses, the fruits and vegetables on the right side of the chart. The other reason that I show this chart is to kind of illustrate the concept of consumption-based emissions, which I'm sure most in this audience are already familiar with. They're called consumption-based emissions, embedded emissions, upstream emissions, or scope 3 emissions, if you want to get technical about it. And basically all of the emissions, the green bar shows the production stage emissions, so everything that happens before this food leaves the farm gate. And the orange shows what happens in the processing and transportation stage. But all of this is embedded in the food that we end up buying. And I think this is important to note for cities in particular, because oftentimes cities aren't tracking or making very notable efforts to reduce their consumption-based emissions. Most of the international climate accounting frameworks focus on the production-based emissions. But cities really are the centers of consumption when it comes to food and not production. And oftentimes the network C40 did an analysis of the cities in their network and found that for 80% of those cities, the consumption-based emissions were higher than their sector-based emissions. So in other words, the sector-based emissions would be like the what's coming out of the tailpipe of a car, and the consumption-based emissions would be the emissions that went into making that car somewhere else that was then consumed by the city. And if we don't address consumption-based emissions in addition to production-based emissions, we won't meet our climate goals. So that's one of the key takeaways that I hope you'll take away from this talk, is that insofar as cities that are dictating climate policy, we have to look at the consumption side as the center of consumption. Becky talked already a little bit about why we should care about meat and dairy from a climate and public health perspective. I have just a couple of slides to expand on that. This is from a recent study that came out that showed that the top 5 meat producing companies have greater emissions than ExxonMobil, Shell, or BP. We also know from a public health perspective that processed meat in particular is a known carcinogen according to the World Health Organization, and red meat is a likely carcinogen. Overconsumption of meat is also linked to obesity, diabetes, and heart disease, which are all costly and preventable diseases that, again, governments usually end up footing the bill for, and food purchasing is an important point of leverage for these public health crises as well. So for those reasons, to us, healthy and climate friendly means plant forward. We don't advocate for a completely vegan or completely plant-based diet, but for those high meat consuming countries like the United States and Israel, working to get down to a level that is more on par with the rest of the world and with our dietary guidelines is what we advocate for. So as cities, there are a number of points of leverage that you can have to affect what the people in your cities are eating. But the one that I think is the most direct and that I'm focusing on today is food purchasing and looking at public institutions and how they can shift their purchasing. So this is from a case study that Friends of the Earth conducted with Oakland Unified School District in Northern California. Oakland reduced their meat and dairy purchases in the school by 30% over a period of 2 years, and that resulted in a 6% reduction in their water use, a 14% reduction in their carbon footprint, and they were able to save $42,000. So if they had just, so the 14% reduction in their carbon footprint is equivalent to the carbon reduction they would have achieved by installing 87 solar panels, but that would have cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars. So to be able to instead save money using this strategy is I think a really compelling point that, I think David brought it up in his presentation earlier, that if we can make the cost effectiveness argument as well as the environmental and public health case, we're in a strong position. Another key finding from this pilot analysis that comports with what I showed you earlier is that 76% of Oakland Unified's carbon footprint came from their animal product purchases. So even though animal products account for a relatively small portion of the calories we consume and also a small portion of the protein we consume, they have a very outsized carbon footprint. So if you're a city and you're looking to reduce your carbon footprint through food, meat and dairy reduction is really the place to go more than the other food categories or focusing on transportation. So how to go about shifting towards climate-friendly food service? I'm going to go through a couple policy pathways that you can look at for your own cities and a few examples. So to enact a climate-friendly food procurement policy, there are a number of different avenues that you can look at. So a standalone food procurement policy that dictates the type of food that the city is purchasing. I'll give an example of that in a moment. If you have a green purchasing policy, if your city already has some standards around environmentally preferable goods, like preferencing recycled goods, you can look at adding food to those policies. A climate action plan. In the US now we have, I think it's about 17 climate action plans that acknowledge the role of meat and dairy in climate change, and a number of those look at procurement as a strategy. And then food or wellness policies. And Becky kind of mentioned already, it's the same pathways as Meatless Mondays. You can do an executive order, an official policy, or a declaration integrating into an existing policy. So there are a few pathways here. One standout example of this comes from Malmö, Sweden. They passed this policy a while back that aimed to reduce the carbon footprint of the food that their city is purchasing by 40% by 2020, as well as to purchase 100% organic food, which I believe they're on track for both. And a key strategy here was reducing the amount of meat that they're purchasing. Another example of a policy that just shows, I think, a different lever is from the San Francisco airport. So San Francisco passed a comprehensive executive director in 2009, and what they did is they took the priorities outlined in that executive directive and they incorporated it into guidelines for the vendors at the airport. So if you want to be a vendor at the San Francisco airport, you're given preference to a spot at the airport if you can comply with these policies. So again, looking at airports, hospitals, schools, community colleges, correctional facilities, you have a lot of potential levers. And then another pathway is to develop climate-friendly food standards. So if you are a city that has nutrition standards already, you're 90% of the way there, because the type of nutrition standards that can end up supporting sustainability through meat and dairy reduction are pretty basic. There are things like providing a plant-based option, like having reduced portion sizes available, limiting serving sizes of meat to what the dietary guidelines recommend. A great example of this is the Live Well standards from San Diego. San Diego County serves 7 million meals a year, and they incorporated a number of standards that also support sustainability goals. And this was a project that came out of their health department, but was ultimately a collaboration between a number of agencies. I also wanted to point out on this slide that, if this is too big of a project to get started, I know we're in the workshop for beginners, I think another good place to look is just starting with your own agency. Becky mentioned this too, implementing Meatless Mondays within your own department. Some of the best success stories that I've seen on nutrition standards that emphasize sustainability come from jurisdictions that started it in their own department of, say, a health department. And then when that's successful, they ask the Department of the Environment to adopt it, and spread on and on from there until it's in a good position to become mandatory. All of these examples and these steps come from this resource that we developed at Friends of the Earth. It's a municipal guide to climate-friendly food purchasing that tries to lay out the best examples of jurisdictions, primarily in the US, but some international examples of progressive food purchasing policies that emphasize sustainability and meat reduction, and lays out kind of a step-by-step process for how to go about that in your own city. And then I just wanted to close again by thanking you and saying that Friends of the Earth is available, especially for, we're funded to do this work particularly in the US. So for those US cities that are interested in working with us on policy development and implementation towards this end, please be in touch, and happy to talk and advise other folks as well. So thank you again.
Stay for a moment.
Okay, sure.
Any questions? Yeah, please.
This is not for you, but this is for baking.
Coming up.
This question is coming from one of my colleagues from Seoul Metropolitan Government. And in Seoul, actually, the mayor is strongly initiating types of Eat Less Monday campaign for long years. But we face difficulty that we have strong objection from the meat industry. And then, so right now it's kind of holding stage. So she's wondering what you experiencing the challenges and how you deal with that issues.
Yeah, good, very good question. Is this on? Very good question. Yes, we have